morning and welcome to Amati Insights Call. As you know, we do this every 2 weeks, and we pick a theme which we think is really important, sometimes topical, always investment relevant, where we have meaningful research-based views, often reflected in our portfolio, and we think it's of interest to our clients, our prospects. But of course, nothing we say is a recommendation to buy a stock or a fund, and we encourage you to do your own research. And this is a disclaimer on the screen, and it's also available on our website. And with that, the theme today is something we discussed before. So we're kind of repeating ourselves a bit, but it's still really relevant, and new things happened that warranted us updating our views. And it's electric grid modernization. So we're talking about national electric grids, which require a lot of investment, and things are happening that maybe make that need even more pressing. So over to Graeme to remind us why it matters. What is the basis, of our investment thesis there?
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously quite long-term investors, and people who were familiar with the fund when we started will have heard some of these reasons, but and you'll hear about them on the news, obviously. But just growing electricity demand, more electric vehicles, more heat pumps. Just the drive to net zero is driving more electrification, and that means more infrastructure spending. And we find that the way we're building new energy generation is wind and solar. Typically, those tend to be quite distributed, so not just one big generation plant in the middle of a county. They're spread all over the place. They all need wires to connect them, so a lot more grid connections, and increasingly two-way flow. So residential solar, people want to produce power and put it back into the grid. That requires updating the infrastructure. And obviously things like storms, particularly in the US and other places, fires, there's a lot of hardening of the grid that needs to be done, and we're seeing that a lot all around the world.
Yeah, and
actually, sorry, the last point I should say is that the other thing is there's a lot of investment going into making the grids more flexible. So smart meters you'll have heard about, a lot of you will have them. There are a lot more sensors that go on the grid, and a lot of that is being driven by AI increasingly.
Yeah, I mean, no conversation about anything is complete without AI these days, but we've seen a remarkable acceleration of demand for energy from AI. Both, there's giant data centers that are being built at very high rate. There's certain parts of the US which are literally running out of available power because of this incremental demands. But there are other reasons for that as well. Yes, the EV penetration, and we've talked about it in some length in our previous calls and in our materials. The EV penetration may have taken a bit of a pause in some Western markets, not in China, but in Europe and the US. But the electrification by stealth, as we call it, continues. Cars are becoming a bit more electrified. And on average, per mile driven, the balance of energy is shifting from hydrocarbons to electricity. And the reshoring, I mean, we're now seeing a real boom in semiconductor plants. These are fairly energy intensive plants, but if the US administration agenda for reindustrialization of the US is to come true, we need to meaningfully increase domestic consumption of the electricity. So both the capacity of the grid and the complexity of the grid and the intermittence of energy generation in the grid because of all this renewables in the mix, as well as the need to harden it and connect it within itself and with its neighbors, is going up, and it's all pressing on the grid investment, and of course the regulatory and the politics agenda is changing that too. So Trump sounds like he's against net zero and should be bad news for this, but actually in some ways he's not.
No, that's right. And I mean, he's clearly made some negative overtures towards offshore wind, which he thinks is expensive and not efficient use of capital. But in other parts, solar is still doing very well, and he has pushed forward with one of the things he talked about a lot when he was doing his initial campaign, which is making the permitting much more open and available. So one of the things that companies have complained about over the last few years was there are a lot of projects that were sort of ready to go but couldn't get approval for permitting reasons. And Trump has definitely got his foot on the throat of the EPA to make sure that they and some of the other regulators are easing up the ability for companies to make these investments. And obviously the reshoring thing you mentioned is clearly part of his real focus here, getting a lot more heavy industries, particularly back into the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to see what the US might look like under Trump, you look at Florida, not just because that's where Mar-a-Lago is based, but because it's a Republican-run, fairly right-wing state with with appropriate policies in all sorts of areas, including energy regulation. So we spoke to a utility recently, which has most of its business in Florida, and it's interesting. They are growing their asset base, effectively growing the pool of their assets 7 to 8% per year, so which is very high clip for utilities, which tend to be very stable businesses. It is translating for them for a $20 billion 5-year capital plan. And the two biggest buckets for that are transmission distribution, so grid, and interestingly, solar. And they said, solar is growing in their mix, and they're saying, obviously, Florida is a sunshine state. I think that's the official motto. But they're saying that there are no incentives for solar in Florida. It's entirely driven by the unit, unsubsidized unit economics. So it is kind of a very strong driver. And in the same vein, they're saying that uh, the materiality of electric vehicles penetration is such that what did they say? They said 4 electric vehicles in terms of energy consumption. Adding 4 electric vehicles to the state equals adding one Florida residential home. Which is and if you imagine Florida, it's a hot state, a lot of air conditioning, a
Yeah.
lot of energy consumption. It's a really meaningful change.
Yeah, no doubt. And in fact, we invest in a company that actually does the sort of physical building of the infrastructure, a company called Mastec. And they definitely, they're very much at the coalface, as it were. They deal with the utilities directly. They actually put up the pylons. And their latest numbers just recently, they were very upbeat about investment. They mentioned that they felt very good about the future of renewables. I'm quoting them here, as a competitive source of clean power. And they saw their backlog grow. Their book to bill was up 1.2, which means kind of 20% increase on the booked, the bookings versus what they're actually currently doing. And they said the transmission market is incredibly robust, and there are a number of projects they see being awarded in late this year or early next year. And interestingly, we also own and have owned on and off actually since we started the fund, a company called Prismian, which is an Italian company that makes the cables, the high voltage cables, amongst others. And on their recent call, again, just in the last few days, they said transmission KPIs all super great, super satisfactory. Organic growth in particular at 60% and has never been that high. So you can see why we're quite excited about that this investment is actually starting to happen.
Yeah, and it's not just a US phenomenon. One of the other big recent news, which we talked about Spanish blackouts, that Spanish and Portuguese blackouts that focused market's attention on this issue. We talked about Trump, which defines a lot of news flow. But the other thing that happened over the past couple of months is the German election leading up to this unprecedented German stimulus. And a lot of talk is about the defense spending, but over a trillion of German stimulus in the works. Half of it, 500 billion, is on infrastructure, and of this, 100 billion is a lot of money, is earmarked for what is called energy transition, but a lot will go to grid upgrade. And it's interesting, there was a real bipartisan consensus. When we had this kind of conversations 3 years ago, grid investment in Europe was often sort of framed in a kind of green transition, energy transition framework. Now, grid investment is all about industrial renaissance, and we're likely to see a bipartisan support across Germany in what used to be a very slow progress. We had a conversation with a policy expert in Germany recently, where it was clearly viewed as one of the underinvested areas, and this should accelerate. And if you look around the world, this is happening everywhere. Our companies not necessarily have access to all the markets, but if you look at China, it's a lot more electrified, isn't it, Graham? The percentage of energy mix in China that's electric is much higher.
Yeah, much higher. It's a much more electricity intensive sort of economy. I mean, effectively what that means is in order to produce goods, they burn less coal and oil or fossil fuels, gas. They do more of it from converting photons or wind effectively into electricity, which they then use to produce things. So they're at about 28% of their electricity consumption versus 22% in the EU and about the same in the US. So there's a lot of upgrade that needs to happen in the West, particularly to kind of get to that level of electricity penetration, which will happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good. Go ahead, Graham.
I was going to say that just we hear these numbers from lots of different places. The IEA, International Energy Agency, in their recent report said they can see investment in renewables continuing to really grow very quickly. So from around 300 billion a year to needing to get to about 600 billion a year by 2030. So there's you can see this incredible still rate of growth that needs to happen and all of that needs to be connected to the grid, which is again why it makes us excited about the whole thing.
Yeah. So what does it mean for our portfolio? It's the grid modernization is one of the more prosaic parts of our innovation portfolio. It's not. These things are very hard to do well, but they're not in themselves, a leading edge technology. Although, transmitting this voltages, on the seabed at the reliability that they achieve requires, a lot of material science, a lot of expertise. But when we look at what we own in that space, a lot of that is what we call enablers. So kind of picks and shovels, literally, for the electrification of all this use cases. Graeme mentioned Mastec, which is the infrastructure construction company. A lot of their business, big chunk of their business is electric grid networks. We also have Prysmian, which is the Italian company that makes this high voltage cables as well as mid voltage. If you imagine, the big things that sort of land into the city of pylons, then they get distributed in the community through this mid voltage cables, and then eventually into your neighborhood from a lower voltage cables. They do all those. And Hubble, which makes all sorts of fixtures and fittings, as we sometimes joke, things to which cables connect and things on which cables hang. They also make smart grid equipment. One of their divisions makes smart electric and gas meters as well, but electric meters primarily. And that's the area we're looking into in more detail. The smart grid concept is becoming more and more prominent. There are only a couple of companies that are pure plays in that space, and we're hard at work researching them as we speak. So that's us in a nutshell. We talked about this before, but the Spanish blackouts, regulatory changes in the US which are coming and already making an impact, and this German stimulus which is likely to spend more, billions more on grid upgrade in Germany, are the new news that make this innovation frontier in our portfolio more relevant and prompted us to remind you that that's an area of opportunity we're very excited about. So
Yeah,
thanks for your
and
time.
it's
Oh,
and
sorry,
it's
go
an
ahead.
another AI play. That's the
Yeah,
mark. So exciting.
well, I mean, that's an interesting one because it contributed to its performance, and we're guilty of taking some profits on the back of that because we thought market was getting a bit too exuberant, and then as market had a sort of deep seek, slightly risk off moment, and we've seen some AI plays retract. A good value is again available in that space, and you don't need AI to be spectacularly successful for our investors to make money on the stocks. That grid investment is happening regardless. So with that, have